Joseph Castorena, and he shouldn't be at this house in the middle of the night. There's actually a protective order against him to keep him away from his ex-girlfriend and her family's home. What would happen next would leave a community in terror and lead to an international manhunt.
This one is really tough. I mean, we're diving into this story about a family in Aurora, Colorado, right before Halloween in 2022.
Oh, geez.
And, they were coming home from a party, excited for the holiday, And then, well, it became a horrific crime scene.
Right.
And we've got court documents, police reports. We even have the 911 call.
Oh, wow.
And honestly, it's going to be really hard to listen to some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to try and understand how something like this could even happen.
Right.
You know what went wrong.
Yeah.
We can maybe learn from it.
It is fascinating, isn't it? You think about, Halloween, it's a time for kids and fun.
Right.
And then this just like darkness descends on this family.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more chilling is that everything we've read about this family, they were a seemingly ordinary family before this night.
Right.
They were active in their church, involved in their community.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that these kinds of things, these tragedies, they can really strike anywhere, anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sent over Jessica Serrano's 911 call.
Right.
She was the sole survivor of this attack. And I have to say, just reading the transcript was hard enough.
Yeah.
But hearing her voice, the fear, the confusion,
right.
It's just gut-wrenching.
It really highlights just the chaotic nature of domestic violence. And just in those initial moments of this call, Jessica is reporting that she found her ex-boyfriend Joseph's jacket and his keys in her room. And she's suspecting that he might be hiding in the house. She even mentions that there's a protective order against him.
Oh, wow.
Which, for those unfamiliar, that's a legal document issued by a court to prevent someone from contacting or approaching another person.
That detail alone is chilling. It makes you wonder, did she have any idea of the danger she was in, or was she still maybe hoping that things could be different, that he wouldn't actually hurt her or her family?
It's a question that comes up so often in these cases. Victims of domestic violence experience such a complex mix of emotions: fear, love, hope, denial. And often they're also trying to protect their abuser, maybe downplaying the danger or making excuses for their behavior.
And then just moments later in that 911 call, we hear gunshots.
Oh, my gosh.
And everything changes in an instant.
Yeah.
Jessica's pleas for help, they just become frantic, desperate.
It's so hard to imagine what was going through her mind at that moment.
What's so striking in this audio is the speed at which the situation escalated.
Yeah.
1 minute, she's reporting, suspicious items.
Right.
And the next, it's a full-blown massacre. It's just a terrifying example of how quickly domestic violence can turn deadly.
And the police arrived to this just truly horrific scene. Jessica's twin sister, Maria Anna Green, her husband, Ken, and their father, Jesus Serrano, all shot dead.
Oh.
Even a family friend, Rudolfo Perez, who was renting a camper from them, he was found murdered in the kitchen.
Oh, my God.
It's just unimaginable.
The scale of this tragedy is immense.
Right.
5 lives lost in a matter of minutes.
Just like that. Sergeant Davis was the first officer on the scene, and he described it as just the worst thing he'd ever seen in his career. And listening to that audio of him trying to comfort Jessica, she's in shock, asking about her family, and he's trying to, shield her from the full extent of what happened.
You can hear the emotion in his voice.
Right.
The compassion he has for this young woman who's just lost everything. I can't imagine the toll that this kind of work takes on first responders, dealing with this level of human suffering every day.
Yeah, it's a testament to their professionalism and resilience. They have to compartmentalize, focus on the task at hand, even in the face of just unimaginable horror.
And as they're processing this horrific crime scene, the manhunt for Joseph Castorena begins. He's immediately identified as the prime suspect, and it becomes this desperate race against time to find him before he disappears completely.
What's so interesting is that he appears to have had no car, no money, and he fled on foot in freezing temperatures.
Wow.
It makes you wonder, was this a spur-of-the-moment thing, or was there some level of premeditation involved?
That's a great question. I mean, how does someone pull off a disappearance like this, seemingly out of nowhere? Did he have a plan? Was he getting help?
Those are exactly the questions that investigators were grappling with. And so they searched Joseph's parents' house. And that's where the first cracks in the case started to appear.
Okay.
They discovered that Joseph's older brother, Juan Angel, admitted to helping him escape. He even drove him to Denver and handed him off to another relative.
So already we see this web of relationships starting to unravel. And it makes you wonder about the pressure that must have been on these family members.
Oh, yeah.
They must have been so torn between loyalty and the law, knowing that they were aiding someone who committed this horrific crime.
Yeah. It raises this difficult ethical dilemma.
Right.
How do you balance those competing obligations? Do you protect your family even when they've done something terrible? Or do you uphold the law, knowing that it could have, devastating consequences for the people you love?
It's a choice that none of us ever want to face. But it's clear that Joseph's actions had repercussions that went way beyond the immediate victims.
Oh, absolutely.
His family is now entangled in this web of tragedy. Their lives irrevocably changed. And while the police are piecing together his escape route, they're also digging into the history of his relationship with Jessica.
Yeah.
And from what I've read, this wasn't just a few arguments or disagreements.
Right.
This was a deeply troubled relationship.
You're absolutely right. There's evidence of a really long-standing pattern of domestic abuse, and it seems like it was escalating over time. We know there was a protective order in place.
Right.
There were previous incidents where the police had been called. The sources even mentioned this car incident where Joseph allegedly held Jessica at gunpoint.
And there's this audio clip from Jessica's mother talking to the news, and she's absolutely heartbroken, saying they tried to warn everyone about Joseph, but it felt like no one was listening.
Right.
And it breaks your heart to hear the desperation in her voice.
It's a tragically common sentiment in cases of domestic violence.
Yeah.
You know that feeling of helplessness from those trying to protect the victim? And the frustration with a system that can sometimes fail to intervene effectively.
It's a reminder that these tragedies don't happen in a vacuum. They're often warning signs, missed opportunities, and systemic failures that contribute to this escalation of violence. And in this case, it ultimately led to the deaths of 5 innocent people.
We're going to delve deeper into those systemic issues a bit later.
Okay.
But for now, let's shift our focus back to Joseph. He's on the run, and he's relying on this network of family and friends, people who are putting themselves at risk to help him.
Right.
It's December, freezing cold outside, and he's out there with practically nothing.
It sounds more like a movie than real life. But the sources do paint a vivid picture of Joseph's desperate flight. We know that his cousin Joel gave him shoes after the murders. And he admitted that Joseph seemed high and kept saying he had messed up.
Oh, wow.
And then there's Juan, his younger brother, who risked everything to drive him to Denver.
It's fascinating to consider the psychology of someone on the run, like
Right, yeah.
desperation, the fear, the constant looking over your shoulder. What kind of toll does that even take on a person?
I can only imagine. And what about the people who are helping him? What's
Yeah.
going through their minds? Are they driven by loyalty, fear, or are they just caught in this web they don't know how to escape?
It's a complex web indeed. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore how Joseph evaded capture for over a month.
Okay.
The clues that ultimately led to his arrest in Mexico, and the confession he ultimately gave to the police.
So before we get into Joseph's capture, I got to ask you,
Yeah.
how did he manage to stay off the radar for over a month? I mean, no car, freezing cold, and there's a nationwide manhunt. It seems impossible.
It is remarkable.
Right.
And the sources actually give us a little insight into his tactics. Remember those early cell phone pings they placed him near the crime scene, right?
Right.
And then nothing. Silence? Investigators think he was either using, burner phones, or maybe someone else was handling his communication entirely.
Okay, so that makes sense. I guess in this day and age, disappearing completely is pretty tough. But even with those tactics, you'd think somebody somewhere would have noticed him, right?
Well, that's where that network of family and friends comes in. Remember Juan?
Yeah, his brother who drove him to Denver.
Right. He didn't just drop him off like on some random street corner.
Right.
The sources say he actually handed Joseph off to another relative, a guy named Carlos Flores.
Ah, so it wasn't just like aimless wandering.
Right.
There was at least some planning involved, especially in those first few days.
Yeah, definitely in those initial stages. And it makes you think about the immense pressure on everyone involved. Just imagine you get a call from a relative you haven't seen in years. Desperate, needs help. And then you find out what he's done. And the sources suggest that this happened to a few of Joseph's relatives. They were put in this impossible position, forced to choose between family and, doing the right thing, upholding the law.
Yeah, and some of them refused to help him. Knowing what he'd done, I can't imagine how difficult that decision must have been.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder of how these tragedies, these events, they don't just impact the immediate victims.
Right.
They reach out, they touch families, friends,
Everyone.
even acquaintances,
Right.
forcing them to confront these really unthinkable moral dilemmas.
And ultimately, he ends up in Mexico, a country he knew a bit from a previous trip. He went there for his grandfather's funeral. So he had some family there, some connections he may have been hoping he could, use to his advantage.
Right, and it added this whole other layer of complexity to the manhunt.
Yeah.
Now investigators had to deal with jurisdictional issues, language barriers, and the challenges of tracking someone across international borders.
Yeah.
But as we learned from the sources, those family ties, those connections, they weren't as strong as Joseph might have hoped. It seems that he had alienated a lot of his relatives during that earlier trip for the funeral.
Wow. Talk about burning bridges at the worst possible time.
Yeah.
So even though he had these connections in Mexico, they just weren't willing to help him to harbor a fugitive, especially one accused of such a horrific crime.
Exactly. And it really highlights how important those social connections are.
Yeah.
Not just in times of crisis, but throughout our lives.
Right.
When those bonds are strong, they can be such a source of support, of guidance. But when they're broken, we can be left completely adrift, especially in the face of, really difficult circumstances.
So picture this. You're Joseph, alone in a foreign country, desperate, running out of options, and you're not exactly blending in. 5'4" with a huge lion tattoo on your neck.
Right.
It's kind of hard to miss.
And that, as the sources detail, is what ultimately led to his downfall.
Yeah.
Local police in Aguascalientes noticed him, recognized him from those wanted posters. They apprehended him on December 10th, 2022, a month on the run, and it was finally over.
It's almost a cliche, isn't it?
Yeah.
The fugitive who thinks he can just disappear,
Right.
but then he gets caught because of something he can't change,
Exactly.
couldn't hide. But it is interesting, you sent over the audio from Joseph's interviews, both with the Mexican and the American authorities.
Oh, yeah.
And the approaches, they were pretty different.
The contrast is really striking. Joseph describes the Mexican authorities as, and this is a quote, a little more brutal. Whereas the Colorado detectives, the ones that flew down to get him, they were much gentler. They offered him water, assured him he wouldn't be mistreated.
Yeah.
They even tried to get him to open up a little, saying they wanted to hear his side of the story.
Oh.
But Joseph, clearly exhausted and, probably terrified, insisted on having an attorney present.
It's a good reminder that even in these types of cases, even in the face of these horrific crimes, due process has to be followed. I mean, everyone, no matter what they've allegedly done, deserves legal representation.
It really does speak to their professionalism.
Yeah.
And their understanding of the legal system. They weren't just trying to get a confession.
Right.
They wanted to build a solid case, one that would hold up in court.
So, with Joseph's capture, it marked the beginning of a long and complex legal process.
Absolutely.
And while the wheels of justice were turning, I'm sure the families of the victims were grappling with their grief, trying to make sense of this just unimaginable loss.
Oh, absolutely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore that trial.
Okay.
The evidence that was presented against Joseph, and ultimately the verdict. We'll also look at the aftermath of this tragedy.
Yeah.
And consider some of the broader societal questions it raises about domestic violence, gun control,
Right.
and just the challenge of how we prevent these horrific events.
Okay, so we've talked about the crime, we've talked about the escape, the capture, but now let's talk about the long road to justice. After being extradited from Mexico, Joseph Castorena faced trial for these murders nearly 2 years after they happened.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine that it's going to be wait for the victims' families, to know he's locked up but still have to go through this whole legal process, relive all the horror.
It's a good point, and it's something that often gets overlooked in these really high-profile cases.
Right.
For these families, it's not just some news story.
Right.
This is their lives, their loved ones.
Exactly.
The need for closure, for some sense of accountability, those feelings have got to be just incredibly intense.
And the trial itself, from what I've read, it sounds like it was pretty intense. The prosecution, they really laid out a detailed case, focusing on that 911 call, shell casings that matched a previous incident involving Joseph, witness testimonies. They even brought up his own words, from those interviews in Mexico.
It's fascinating to see how they actually constructed that case. They weren't relying on just one piece of evidence.
Right.
They were really, really weaving together forensic science, eyewitness accounts, expert analysis. It was a multi-layered approach to proving, without a doubt, that Joseph was guilty.
What about the defense? Did they try to argue that he wasn't responsible? Or that maybe someone else committed the murders?
From what I've gathered, it seems like the defense really focused on trying to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline. They tried to suggest that Joseph couldn't have physically been at the crime scene when the murders took place.
Okay.
They also questioned the reliability of some of the witnesses, which, is a fairly common strategy in cases like this.
But in the end, none of it worked.
Yeah.
The jury deliberated for several days, and ultimately they came back with a guilty verdict.
Wow.
On all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. And it was a unanimous decision.
It's a really powerful thing when you see the legal system work as intended.
Yeah.
All that incredibly meticulous work by law enforcement, by the prosecution, everyone who was involved, it all led up to that moment. And that verdict, hopefully, provided at least some measure of justice for the victims and their families.
In the sentencing, what was the final outcome?
Well, given the severity of the crimes and the devastating impact on those families, the judge handed down 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Wow.
It was a sentence that ensured that Joseph would never be a threat to society again.
4 consecutive life sentences. It really hits you, the magnitude of what happened that night.
Yeah.
And just how permanent those choices, those actions were.
It really does, but it also brings up this really difficult question. Does any sentence, no matter how harsh, truly bring closure? Can it really erase the pain, the suffering caused by these horrific acts?
That's a tough one. And there's this quote from one of the articles from Jessica's mother, and it's just stuck with me. She said, "I just want my daughters back."
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking. It speaks to this profound loss that these families will carry with them forever.
It really underscores the fact that the legal system, while crucial for accountability, it can't heal those emotional wounds, the ones that are left behind by these types of tragedies.
Right.
And it leads us to an even bigger question. What can we, all of us, learn from this? How can we as a society do a better job of recognizing these warning signs, the signs of domestic violence,
right,
and then actually addressing them?
Yeah, it's something that's really been haunting me after going through all of this material. It seems so clear now,
Yeah.
There were red flags all along.
Absolutely.
The protective order,
Right.
the history of violence,
Yeah.
the calls to the police. Could something more have been done
Right.
to intervene, to protect Jessica and her family?
It's such a complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But I do think this case highlights the need for just so much more awareness about domestic violence, more support systems for victims, and maybe a more proactive approach to intervention.
Yeah, and the sources we looked at, they did mention resources for victims of domestic violence.
Yeah.
Hotlines, shelters, counseling services. I mean, it is so important to remember that there is help out there.
Absolutely.
And no one has to go through this alone. No one should suffer in silence.
Exactly. And if anyone out there listening is experiencing domestic violence, or if you know someone who is, please reach out. There are people who care,
Yeah.
people who understand, and people who can help you navigate what can be some really, really difficult and often really dangerous situations.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. A horrific crime.
Yeah.
A desperate escape, a long road to justice, and of course, the enduring impact on the victims and their families. It's one of those stories that really sticks with you,
It is.
It makes you think about how fragile life really is and the choices that we all make.
It does. And if there's one thing I really hope our listeners take away from all of this, it would be the importance of recognizing those signs. Yeah. The signs of domestic violence, and then speaking up when you see something concerning, and offering support to those who might need it most.
We can't bring back the victims of this tragedy, but we can honor their memory by working to prevent future tragedies.
Absolutely.
By supporting organizations dedicated to combating domestic violence, by educating ourselves and our communities, by being vigilant, by being compassionate.
Well said. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to encourage each of you listening to take a moment and reflect on what you can do, no matter how small, to make a difference. Because even the smallest acts of kindness, of awareness, they can have this huge ripple effect.
Thanks for joining us on this honestly really difficult but so important journey.
Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.